I'd like to welcome our guests. I understand that AMCS 200, is that it? No? Yeah. It's here. Thank you for coming. What? English 401. Where's English 401? Thank you for coming. I have a couple of announcements beforehand, but I'm glad that Humanities AMCS is here because we have some information for you that you may want to take note of. Ilka, would you raise your hand? Ilka Hart, would you stand up? You see Ilka Hartman? She is collecting additional names. You may clap for her if you'd like. She is collecting additional names for students who would like to work on the Human Rights Club efforts for Sudan. Our
Melissa and Jen, are you here?
Melissa and Jen,
Stand up.
would you stand up? We have two students who are spearheading our efforts. We had a lecture a couple of weeks ago from Jerry Fowler, who is the director of the Committee on Conscience at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And our students were moved enough to want to do something about the genocide that is occurring in Sudan. If you don't know about it, AMCS 200, you may want to learn about it. So, yes?
Oh, I sent an email this afternoon to everyone, everyone's address that you had given me. So.
Okay. Ilka's going to collect some more email addresses if you would like to be included, and she will forward that to you. Jen, did you see Jen? Jen, Melissa, Jen. Faculty took great note at the assignment date for the next response paper, which was supposed to be on Thursday, and we have changed it to next Tuesday. So your next response paper is due on Tuesday the 19th. I don't hear any disappointment. Thank you. Okay. There are a couple of events I'd like to inform you about that are coming up next month. You may want to just put the dates aside. We may have some exciting news about one of them. On May 8th, the annual Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust commemoration, that has been taking place on the Sonoma State campus, and that is sponsored, among other groups, by the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, will be in the Cooperage at 2 p.m. So you may want to mark your calendars if you're thinking of increasing your odds of getting a better grade. We'll give you more details to follow. Also on May 1st, Congregation Shomrei Torah, which is in Santa Rosa, is having a talk by Richard Rubenstein, who is not only a rabbi but a Holocaust scholar. On May 12th at the Rialto Theater, there's going to be a showing of the movie Exodus 1947, which is about efforts by Holocaust survivors to return, or to go to what was then Palestine. We'll be sending all of our classes an email detailing all of these events. Just wanted to give you a heads up. One of the readings for this week was Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. It was not on eReserve. It will be on eReserve. Probably tomorrow. It's a short article from a kind of an abbreviated article from Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men, and is a very good analysis of people who became perpetrators. I'm going to need to get my flashlight. Well, maybe we'll do it. lights on. This is where I get to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Myrna Goodman. I'm the director of the Holocaust Study Center and also professor in the Sociology department. And I am the person who knows about the Holocaust on campus because I'm going to explain to you why. So let's get going here. No. Thank you. Those of you who don't know Jessica, I would be pretty useless without her. She gives me a great deal of help. The lecture today is The Sociology of Resistance, and the subtitle is Resistance and Rescue in Wartime Denmark. And I use the Danish example, to try and point out how resistance develops, how it becomes something internal and becomes something social. But first I want to tell you about how I came to this subject. As a young girl, I read the Diary of Anne Frank, like many of you, and became puzzled as a Jewish child by what in the world would cause people to do the kinds of things that were done to the Jews. And that started a lifelong quest for me to understand the perpetrators of the Holocaust. How could people do that? I know I couldn't imagine myself doing anything like that. And so I take much of my inspiration from Anne Frank, or as she was known, Anna Frank. And if you can see, can you read the translation of her picture? This is my favorite picture of her. It says, "This is a photo as I would wish myself to look all the time. Then I would maybe have a chance to come to Hollywood." So even 60 years ago, more than 60 years ago, young girls were hoping to be stars. I read for a whole lifetime as an adult about the Holocaust, trying to figure out perpetrators. And after each book that I read, I was more confused than the last time because supposedly I was supposed to understand at this point. And then around the early 60s, Adolf Eichmann, who you may remember from your book, was captured by the Israelis in Argentina and taken to Jerusalem to be tried. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of strong feeling about who Eichmann was. So he testified sitting inside of a glass booth because they were afraid someone might try to kill him. Eichmann was the man who was in charge of sending all of the Jews from Western Europe to the death camps in Poland. And one of the people who went to the trial was a very famous German refugee, German Jewish refugee by the name of Hannah Arendt. And you can't really tell it in this picture, but she came to the conclusion that Eichmann was this mousy-looking bureaucrat. And she wrote a series of articles for the New Yorker that eventually became the book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And so it was a very important book for me to read because I was interested in perpetrators. And as I went through the book, once again, any explanation for this man's actions were not sufficient for me. And then I came across page 171 in the book, where she said, "One is tempted to recommend the story of the Danish rescue as required reading in political science for all students who wish to learn something about the enormous power potential inherent in nonviolent action and in resistance to an opponent possessing vastly superior means of violence." And she went on to detail what happened in Denmark during the Holocaust. It was at that time that my interest in the Holocaust took a left turn, and I began to wonder about the people who were rescuers. So my goals for today in this lecture are, first of all, to help you understand the nature of collective resistance by exploring the Danish experience during the Holocaust, to understand collective resistance during the Holocaust and how it evolved, and to explore how individual action, how we as individuals can transform into, how individual action can transform into collective or organized resistance, which is ultimately a social activity. So how do we get from that state that everybody wants us to stay in, and that is isolated individuals, and what is the process by which we move to wanting to act as not as individuals, but as a collective? So what I'm going to do is briefly describe the rescue of the Danish Jews, and then I'll give you perhaps a few of the larger details to show how it fit into what was happening in Europe. And lastly, I'll end with a discussion of the civilian reactions to the German occupation and the social and political evolution of the resistance. So first I'd like you to, this is going to be on e-reserves, but you can see that I've laid out the goals here. The first thing I'd like you to think about is the forms of rescue activity that took place. And that you should know that when it comes to rescue efforts during the Holocaust, most historians and social scientists have looked at individuals who rescued, the Schindlers, although heaven knows Schindler wasn't alone. They wanted to know what turns a person into the kind of person who would risk their life. What kind of person would rescue people in such terrible circumstances as the Holocaust? We got word today, or I did, that someone who was in the German army, a German army officer, has just been awarded the title of righteous person, posthumously, because he's since passed on, because he sheltered 1,200 people in a workshop in Poland. And one of the survivors' sons wanted to know who he was, and it took him a great deal of effort to show that. But that's been what the preoccupation has been. What makes individuals do things like that? And upon confronting the Danish case, I wanted to know, how do individuals, as a sociologist, how do individuals get together to do that kind of thing. And because they focused on individuals, what's happened is the kinds of things like happened in Denmark are often not analyzed. This is from the Holocaust Museum, and it's a map of Denmark and Sweden. Students in the class have read my essay, which appeared in this collection about the rescue, and they know that one of the reasons that the Danes were able to be so successful was because they were able to ship this, or evacuate the Jews to Sweden. You can see how close Sweden is to Denmark. Well, the Danish case is a very dramatic example of collective action or social defense of the Jews during the war. And just very basically, following an attempt by the Germans to deport all of the Danish Jews to the extermination camps, approximately 8,000 Jews in Denmark were evacuated over a 3-month period of time to Sweden. And you can see all the places that they left from. If you go to e-reserves and you go to Sociology 305, I believe that the essay is up there, but also students in the class were emailed a Word version of a student reading version of the article. Well, how do historians explain what happened? Well, from the article you know that historians generally attribute the rescue of the Jews to the fact that the Germans weren't very, the occupation of Denmark was not very, how should we say, it wasn't like it was in Poland. It was not a very strict or oppressive occupation. But they also say that, well, there were a small number of Danish Jews, only 8,000. They didn't care about just getting those 8,000. And, well, Sweden was right close by. You could just take them over there. It was easy to get them over there. And the third thing was that it was a rather late date in the war. By October of 1943, it was very clear that the Germans were probably going to lose the war. And so people were more willing to confront them. Well, although the Jews represented only 3/10 of the population of Denmark, that proportion was exactly the same as the number of the proportion of German Jews. 0.3%. 97% of the Danish Jews survived the war, and only 5% of the German Jews did. So I didn't think that that was irrefutable proof of why it happened. Close by, a neutral country like Sweden close by. If you remember your maps, well, maybe we didn't have Switzerland on the map. Switzerland was a neutral country, and they always turned people away. There were very few people who could take refuge in Switzerland. So Jews that traveled through Germany, France, Spain, trying to get to Switzerland from Spain, were turned away at the border. So that wasn't valid. And the problem of it being late in the war, I didn't think was as important as some other factors. I'd like you to look at the map again, and you can see You see that little place down there, Germany? How close? There's a part of Denmark you don't see, which is farther to the west. That is, they share a landmass. So Denmark is connected geographically. Anyway, I didn't feel that those factors could fully explain how the Danes were able to manipulate conditions to their advantage, or why the vast majority of Danish citizens so closely identified the preservation of the Danish way of life with the safety of the Jews who were living in Denmark. I want you to understand that what I'm looking at here today is the processes. How did all of this happen? There were, obviously, things were different in Poland than they were in Denmark, and that the possibility that what happened in Denmark probably couldn't have happened in Poland, but I'm still interested in looking at that process. So, I intend to explain how, in the context of Danish public and private solidarity and changing political opportunities, a diverse and extensive network of early risers, people who were the early resistors, people who didn't say, well, let's see how things turn out, people who said, this is bad and I don't want it to happen, and they said it early on. Average citizens, political activists, business and religious leaders, as well as members of the organized Danish resistance movement, mobilized effective support for the Jews in Denmark. It's important to remember that the larger Danish resistance movement was building, but it was the attempt to deport the Jews that made it explode. I also use the phrase Jews in Denmark as opposed to Danish Jews or Jewish Danes. And the reason I use the term Jews in Denmark is because many of the people were not Danish citizens. They were refugees who had fled to Denmark. There were young children who had gone to Denmark for summer camp from Germany and Czechoslovakia who could not go back home. And there were also people who had come to Denmark who just didn't make it with their fellow countrymen when most people were traveling to the United States and England in the early part of the century. So whether you were a citizen or not did not matter. When the Danes considered you, they considered every single Jew part of their responsibility. That was unheard of. In Greece, and Bulgaria, Jews who came from different places were very clearly separated out, and they said, well, you can have those Jews, but you can't have our Jews. In Denmark, anybody who was Jewish got protection, citizen or not. That was totally unique. Well, in 1943, resistance and sabotage began to occur with too much frequency for the Germans. And so this lovely looking fellow, Werner Best, who was the highest German official in Germany, was called back to Germany and read the Riot Act by, among other people, Adolf Hitler. He said to him, I want you to stop what's going on in Denmark. And so he came back to Denmark in September of 1943 with the job of deporting the Danish Jews, or the Jews in Denmark. He told this to another German official who was the shipping, he worked organizing the shipping between Germany and Denmark. And he said to him, you need to get some boats ready because we're going to deport the Jews and we're going to send them first to a transit camp and then on to Auschwitz. And and it was due to start on the night of October the 1st, 1943, which was the night before the Jewish High Holy Days began. I always remember this man. He's got a funny name, but when he was told to get the boats ready, what he did was go to a friend of his who was in the Danish government, and he told them the whole story and said, you need to warn the Jews of Denmark that they are going to be deported. His name is George Duckwitz, another righteous person. Another thing that was going on was they were working very furiously with the neutral Swedes to arrange for Sweden to accept 8,000 people. And so Sweden said, and remember, it's almost the end of the war, the Swedes do not have a perfect, unblemished record. They were selling the Germans stainless steel and lots of other things that they could use to make weapons. But the Swedes said, yes, we'll take whoever you send. And so with the warning and the assurance that they could move, they began the preparations for getting the Jews across. I interviewed a lot of people when I was in Denmark twice. One of them was a no longer young man by the name of Erik Grun, who had been a young man during the war. And he said that one night the phone rang in his house, and it was very unusual because people didn't call each other much after 8 o'clock, and he remembered it as being 11 o'clock. And he was startled and answered the phone, and the person on the other end of the phone, who he did not know, said, I need to talk to Mr. Grun. And he said, my father, He said, yes. And he said, may I tell him who's calling? And the person on the other end of the phone said, I don't think that's important. Just let me talk to your father. And after his father hung up the phone, he told Erik that in the morning he was to go and stay with a Gentile friend and to wait for further word. And it was later in that day that Erik and his sister were told to report to the harbor and that they were to meet in a certain place and that they were taken by boat across to Sweden. That was not an unusual situation. Many people were taken across in small fishing boats. Those of you who've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington have seen this boat. Has anybody seen it? Just a few. Those things would be loaded to the gills, as it were, with people down below. It was a very short ride, but not a very pleasant one. This is a typical kind of boat, a little smaller than usual, but it's the one that's at the museum. One person who was a very famous, unfortunately I could never catch up with her, was a doctor who would administer drops to little babies so that they would go to sleep and not cry on the passage over. Often the fishing boats were stopped, and some fast-talking Danish fishermen who remain very prominent rescuers maneuvered their fishing boats across the Sound. They had a lot of help, and they had help from Germans as well, which I'll tell you about. So think about the logistics involved in hiding and transporting not 8,000 men, women, and children to Sweden. The Danes needed boats, and they needed fishermen who were willing to take them across the Sound. This has always been a somewhat, there's some room down here if you'd like to come down. This has always been a somewhat controversial aspect of this, but the fishermen were all paid. A lot of people assume that, well, if they're going to be considered, you can just move that, you can move. If they're going to be considered rescuers, they needed to have done it without being paid, but one needs to understand that everybody who took a chance taking people across, if they were caught, their boat was confiscated. And in a very kind of Danish logic, people said, well, if they're doing that dangerous work, they should get money for it. And also they had given up their time at sea and their livelihood from fishing. There was never a single person who did not get to go across because they didn't have money. The wealthier Jews paid their way as well as the way for others. But one of the most kind of difficult things for me to understand, and one that still leaves me trying to understand it, was these are some scenes that portray the kind of conditions. Small pictures, had trouble making them. Was how that money was raised. Children raised it in school. Now here it is, you're trying to do this surreptitiously. Children raised it in school, putting their little Danish pennies in jars. College students went out into the suburbs of Copenhagen and specifically picked the places where rich people lived and knocked on their doors and said, we're doing a very important thing. We need money. Would you give it to us? And guess what happened? They were given the money. I've read a story of a pastor, a clergyman, who said he used to go into the bank and say to the teller, I have a couple of packages I have to send to Sweden, and I'll need about $500 or $600, or the equivalent. Could you give it to me? And it was given to him, and all he did was sign an IOU. Do you find that amazing? Do you think you could do that? Go down to the Bank of America and say, there's some children in the Sudan who really need help, and I'm collecting money for them. Do you think you could give me some money until I raised it from other people? I don't think so. You have to remember this in order to put all of this into some sort of notion of collective activity. And think about why someone in a bank would give someone else money with just an IOU. There were very few records kept during the rescue, mostly because people didn't want other people to get caught. And so the countless number of people who participated were never fully acknowledged. But it's estimated that there were thousands of people. One of the stories, if you can imagine moving people back and forth, people with suitcases, going to the shipyards, etc. One of the most famous places in the whole story of the Danish rescue was this hospital compound. Bispeberg. Say that one fast. 40 times. The staff at this hospital turned the grounds into a kind of assembly center. And it's estimated that about 2,000 Jews were assisted through this hospital. And what they did was they brought them in taxis, they brought them in ambulances, they brought them in hearses, they brought them in trucks, and they put them all in the wards. And when one of the nurses said to the doctor, well, what should I put on their chart? What illness should I put down? Someone who you'll see a little farther along in the presentation told us, well, the doctor said, German measles, of course. They took them out the same way they brought them in, and you have to understand that this is almost like a park with beautiful old buildings in it. In addition to the doctors in Copenhagen, there were doctors' organizations out in the countryside who always knew when there were strangers in their midst. And many of the Jews had left the big cities and gone out to the countryside to await word on how to get to the seaports so that they could be transported. And so the doctors in the areas always knew when there were strangers in their midst. In general, though, the rescue was accomplished by small groups of rescuers working with individuals and other small groups. I talked to the foremost Danish historian of the resistance, and he told me that he estimated that almost 10,000 Danes, now this is in a country with about 3 million people, almost 10,000 Danes actively participated in the rescue. Wealthy businessmen contributed money to pay for the costs and also to support the Jewish Danes once they got to Sweden. This was in 1943. There were still 2 years to go, almost, and they needed to be supported somehow. The Swedish government helped a bit. Funds that were borrowed by the Danish Jewish Committee were also accounted for and later paid back. But this was all done with a great deal of trust. And I mentioned to you that school children collected money as well. When the operation was over, about 6,000 full Jews, 1,300 partial Jews, and about 700 non-Jews who were married to Jews had been transported to Sweden. No? How do I go backwards, Jess? Previous? Yeah, but this mouse is not working. Again. 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 Perfect. Thank you. I don't know how that happened. I guess I'm going to have to. There's not much room up here. So you can see that there were obviously a lot of children that had to be transported as well. There were some serious problems in Sweden. The men who had gone were upset that they could not be actively involved in an occupation of some kind, and it was not, for most people, a very terrific experience, shall we say. I interviewed someone who was taken across. She was a very little baby. When they came home, the family has a story, and it's one of those stories that's pretty hard to believe. Unlike the vast majority of European Jews, and you've heard survivors talk about how they went home and there was nothing left, or if there was anything left, they couldn't get it. The overwhelming majority of Jews returned to Denmark and found everything still in place. One person told me that her neighbor had, her house plants were all thriving because her neighbor had gone in and watered her plants for her. And I spoke to this one woman who said when they came back, her mother went into the cellar and to get something and noticed that there was one jar of preserved strawberries that was gone. And all of this preserved food was sitting there, and she asked her neighbor who was watching the house, I noticed that there was one jar of strawberries that was gone, and the woman became very upset and said, I took it. And she said, I hope you don't mind. She said, my son was being sent to Germany as a forced laborer, and I wanted to give him some strawberries so he would have something to eat on the trip. Everything else was left. I think if you think about the experiences of the survivors that we've heard, this is rather, it does seem rather strange. And I always say that it never surprises me when I remember that Denmark is the place that Hans Christian Andersen is from. And in fact, they just celebrated his 200th birth anniversary. Okay, so we've got two things we're dealing with here. The first one is resistance. What is resistance, and what are the conditions under which it can occur or does occur? And we've just kind of talked about rescue, which is an act of resistance if you think about it. So let's consider the factors that determine whether resistance could take place in Europe. We need to consider the Germans' primary goals in occupying Europe. But we also need to consider the level of German domination. If you remember, the Germans, when they occupied Poland, did not control, there was no Polish government. The Germans controlled everything, and with a very strong iron hand. It was very difficult to resist in Poland. In Poland, there were regulations where if you helped a Jew escape, you were very often put to death, as was the rest of your family. However, in Denmark and also part of France, what we call Vichy France, the Germans had no control, no real control in there. So we need to think about whether there were Germans and whether they really meant to have a heavy hand. But what were their immediate goals? Well, first they wanted to strip a country of the raw materials and foodstuffs. The minute they occupied a country, they started sending cattle, pigs, anything they could get their hands on, raw materials, steel, sending it back to Germany to feed the war machine. They were especially nice in Denmark because they wanted all of that good Danish butter and eggs. That really was a motivator for them. There are pictures in books Nazi Wehrmacht soldiers carrying packages home to Germany from Denmark, filled with all sorts of things that they were bringing home when they went home on leave. The second thing they did was to conscript labor. Many people had to work in Denmark or in France for the Germans, and there were other people who were sent to Germany as forced laborers. At the end of the war, I think you remember hearing about all of the people who were left over from all over Europe. It wasn't just Jews. Many of them were conscripted workers. Some of them had gone on their own volition, however, to try and make some money because of the unemployment in the various countries. And the third goal was, of course, carrying out the final solution. And they did that by segregating the Jews and then deporting them. You're all familiar now with some of the processes they used. Finding of the identity cards, the church rolls, etc. As the Germans began to institute more of these goals, resistance began to push against them. When it was no longer, oh, the Germans are here, maybe they'll go soon, and more a case of, hey, we're not getting enough to eat, and people are being shipped away, resistance grew, and the strength of the resistors grew. In the context, the Germans dominated by annexing. That's what they did in Poland. I'm sorry, that's what they did in Austria and in Czechoslovakia. They just annexed it and made it part of the German Reich. There was a part of Poland they did that with too, the western part. There were places where there was a direct administration by the Germans, and that happened in Poland. The German just took over the government and ran it. That also happened in Holland. There was something called guardianship, and that's what happened in Denmark. And we're talking about a lowering level of intensity. And then there were the independent allies. And the independent allies to the Germans were the Italians and the Hungarians and the Bulgarians. So the Germans weren't in control there, but they were allies. People had similar goals. Now, resistance took many forms. You've seen this all, familiar to you, during the war. But many of us associate that term with the images we've seen of men and women with bandoliers of bullets strung across their chests, carrying weapons. This is a very typical picture of a resistance, people in the resistance. And although armed resistance played an important role in defeating the Germans, especially late in the war, it was not the most common form of opposition to them. Like other forms of resistance, armed resistance took time to develop and depended on the availability of weapons and explosives, and it usually took the form of sabotage. And by sabotage, I mean one of the things that happened a lot in Denmark was train tracks were blown up so that the Germans couldn't transport troops or any materials from through Denmark to Norway, where they were stationed, where they had many troops stationed. The goal of sabotage and all forms of armed resistance were the imposition of physical damage on German personnel or property. But I want to remind you that armed resistance was not the only kind. I'm not speaking about Jewish resistance today. Our lecture in 2 weeks will be on that topic. But we should keep in mind that Jewish resistance was motivated by life and death concerns and not by ideology. It wasn't whether the Germans were good or bad. It was about, will they kill us this week or will they kill us next week? The non-Jewish resistors in Europe, I think this is a really important point, the non-Jewish resistors were making choices. Jews rarely had choices, and rarely had choices open to them. I found this picture, I wanted to point it out to you. Notice that there are several women in there. This is a group of Jewish resistors that went into the forests of eastern Poland. They're very dense forests in eastern Poland, and you'll hear about how they actually formed things that were called family camps, and they all lived, and many of them survived. So, there were people who automatically became the kind of resistors who wanted to use weapons. I had a man that I interviewed who told me he was a young teenager and it was an exciting time because his chemistry teacher would give him explosives which he would put on the back of his bike. How many of you have ever been to Scandinavia or Europe? Or do you remember how many bikes they would ride? Yeah. Well, it was true then as well. Well, he put all these explosives on the back of his bike and take them from one place to another. So it was an exciting time for many young people. But most people were not footloose and fancy-free. Most were civilians. And so we need to think about what choices were open to civilians during the war. Some of the forms of resistance were very... Katie, would you wake him up? Ask him if he's... Hi. Many of the responses were very similar. When Denmark was invaded, people automatically began wearing the national colors, wearing flags on their lapels, wearing red and white clothing. The same thing happened in Holland. The Dutch royal color is orange. Remember William of Orange? And people began wearing orange flowers, and they wore orange to show to other people their colors, which shouldn't be a totally unfamiliar situation to you. So, one of the first things that people did was to collaborate. And this was usually the action that was taken by the government. They collaborated with the Germans. Many of them saw what they were doing as life-saving. Well, this is only going to be temporary. We'll go along with them. That was also what happened. But of course, there were many Nazis, native Nazis. There were Danish Nazis, French Nazis, who collaborated with the Germans. Governments also, civil servants, accommodated what had happened to them. you'll see a picture of someone who was named a righteous person because he saved several hundred Jews who was in the Danish police, and he would even describe some of his behavior as accommodating the Germans. Then there was passive resistance. This whole idea of wearing colors, making promises to yourself that you wouldn't cooperate. And then social resistance, which is one of the major things I want to talk about. There were two kinds of collaboration, ideological and economic. Ideological collaborators fell in line with the Nazis and actually formed Nazi or fascist parties in their own countries. Many of the members of these fascist groups had been fascists before the war, and in fact, Germany had many people from all over Europe come to Germany to learn about fascist principles. But you have to remember there were a lot of people, just like in Germany, who joined the party after the occupation or after the Germans came to power, and those were opportunists. At one point in Germany, if you didn't belong to the party, it was very hard to get a job. So many people joined the Nazi party, not because they necessarily believed them, but because, or believed in their principles, but because they saw it as a careerist move. Perhaps they should be called opportunistic collaborators. Other people collaborated because of economic reasons. I met someone who lived next to a factory that was producing parts for radios for the German army, and she said that she never knew whether she was going to get a halfway decent night's sleep because they were constantly blowing the factory up. But the people who owned the factory, she said, always had the best of everything, even when times got tough. And they were obviously economic collaborators. They saw an opportunity to make money off of the Germans. One of the most famous collaborators was a man by the name of Quisling. Have you ever heard that term? That someone is a Quisling? I guess it's fallen out of fashion because that was his name. His last name was Quisling. He was a Norwegian, and he just fell right into line with the Germans and began doing their bidding in Norway. And so the term for someone to be a Quisling means for them to be a traitor. So let's talk about accommodation. There was economic accommodation. The government of Denmark was asked to provide some ships from their navy for the German Navy. And they said, let us think about it. And then they forgot about it. And then they were asked again, and they said, oh, we were thinking about it, but we haven't finished thinking about it. And the pressure was put on, and they were asked again, and they said, well, we've almost reached a decision. And then finally they couldn't say no any longer, so they delivered the boats, but the things that the Nazis wanted them for, the small armed guns that were on the deck had been trashed, and so they didn't work. So they gave them the boats, but they were useless to the Germans. It was that kind of pragmatic accommodation that the Danes were most known for. So we've talked about all of these ways of acting externally. We've talked about rescuing. We've talked about sabotage. What we want to talk about now is passive resistance. I would imagine that each one of you, at some time in your life, if not right at this moment, it's taking off on me again.
There it is.
It's back? Thanks. Thank you, Jess. All of you at one time in your life has resisted something passively. And passive resistance is a preliminary state before active resistance. And you need to understand that passive resistance originates inside individuals. A simple example within the context that I'm talking to you about might be a mental decision to just not accept the authority of the Germans. Just to say it in your mind, I do not accept the authority of the Germans. It's passive. It's something you've said to yourself. Don't really have to act out on it. You can just say, I don't accept them as the authority. But as I told you, if you think back, passive resistance can also be exhibited publicly. I mentioned to you the pins that the Danes wore. You know the pins that everybody collects when they go to the Olympics? And they have them all over their hats, and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts wear pins. No sooner did the Germans invade than those pins began popping up. And some of them had the letters for the Danish words that stood for throw them out. They also wore pins with the colors of the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, who at that time were fighting against the Germans. One of the most popular ones, and it really goes on a button, and I'm always afraid to bring it, that I bought when I was in Denmark, is a pin that was struck and commemorated to celebrate the King's 70th birthday. But if you saw someone wearing that, making a point of having it on, it was a way of publicly declaring your sentiment, isn't it? We do it a different way now. We either let people know that we're going to a certain school, or that we wear, more commonly, we wear certain kinds of clothes. We're not passively resisting, but we're making a declaration about ourselves on the outside. So, as passive resistance evolves, it eventually becomes social. And I define social resistance as the process of resisting by the members of a society using unarmed means and mobilizing either society's public institutions or its people, or both at the same time. And I'll read that again. Social resistance is the process of resisting by members of a society using unarmed means and mobilizing either the society's public institutions or its people, or both at the same time. This will all be available on eReserve. I'm going to move along. Social resistance is usually enacted to resist Political submission. It should be noted here that when people feel less submissive, they become more and more uncontrollable. If I feel submissive, if I feel like I might get hurt or I better do what you say, you really can control me, can't you? But if I say, hey, nothing you can do to stop me, I'm not afraid of you, you become less controllable, less predictable. Okay. Basically, I've talked to you about armed resistance. We're talking about attacks against property and physical attacks against person. I now want to talk about the process of moving from passive to collective or social resistance. I've chosen to use the picture of a man who has in the past come to us and stood before us as a real person, but someone who we all, the faculty, hold very dearly and in our hearts. And he's getting on in years. His name is Knud Dybe, and he was a policeman in Copenhagen, and they have verified that he saved well over 100 people, moving them back and forth to fishing boats. He's an important, as I said, an important person to many of us. So let's talk about the different forms of collective resistance. And I want to do it by having you set your mind back to Copenhagen or Denmark in 1943. And although things are almost like on a different planet, I think you probably can imagine in your mind what might have happened. Imagine that you are awakened one morning to the sound of airplanes flying overhead. You go outside and see the sky filled with fighter aircraft and bombers. You realize that after seeing the Nazi swastikas on their tail sections and hearing the explosions in the distance, that war has come to your country. You're a student and you are deathly afraid of what lies ahead. Later that day, you hear on the radio, you turn on your radio, and the king is asking you to stay calm. He's asking the whole nation to stay calm. The government has surrendered, he said, and reached an agreement with the Germans. The king, who you have been taught to respect and who you do respect because he's earned your respect. Now I know that that's part's unfamiliar to you. Asked you to go about your everyday life and to refrain from taking any action towards the Germans. So you have this person who you deeply respect who's asked you to behave in a law-abiding way. So even though you're angry and resentful, you do what you've been brought up to do and what you have always done. You obey the king and follow the law. In your heart, you hate what the Nazis stand for. You've read about and heard about things that they are doing to the German Jews. And there are rumors that there is some kind of persistent persecution going on in Eastern Europe. And you're also ashamed that some of your fellow Danes have succumbed to the fascist ideology. On your way home one day, a German soldier stops you to ask directions. And even though you speak German, and he is a pleasant-looking old man, You act as though you do not understand him and walk away. There are proclamations posted all over the city, signed by the king, continuing to ask you and request that you cooperate with the authorities. But on the bus or the train on the way home, someone slips a mimeograph sheet into your hand, and it is entitled 10 Commandments for a Dane, from a Dane. It's hard to read. Essentially they are, you must not go to work in Germany. You must do bad work for the Germans. You must work in slow motion for the Germans. You must destroy all the tools and machines that could be useful to the Germans. You must destroy anything that can be profitable to the Germans. You must delay transports to Germany. You must boycott German newspapers and films. You must buy nothing from German stores. You must give traitors what they deserve. And you must protect those that the Germans pursue. Well, you've got this piece of paper. What do you do with it? Well, you pass it on to other people. At one point, and I think you saw it there, that printing press, at one point there were 500 underground newspapers in Denmark. That's in a country of 3 million people. 500 newspapers. Every church group, every athletic club, every political party, every student group had their own paper. And in that paper were messages like 10 Commandments from a Dane. As the weeks and months of the German occupation continue, you observe that many people haven't really made much effort to actively resist. Your uncle owns a small metal fabricating plant and is making parts for Germans. Business has never been better for him. A friend whose father works in the shipyard says that German workers are working day and night building and repairing German ships. It is clear to you that some people have chosen the route of economic collaboration with the Germans. There are others who've joined the Danish Nazi Party, and they are attempting to spread their racial hatred in Denmark. Members of the civil service and the government also appear to be collaborating with and cooperating with the Germans. But it's clear that many of them do this because it's their job and because they owe loyalty to the king who's asked them to do that. Later, when the Germans decide to deport the Jews, you realize that members of the government and some of the police take very active roles in the rescue operation. And in fact, Newt Dybee told us, and has told us in the past, that the police told one another exactly how to go and where to go when they were evacuating Jews. In 1943, the military situation of the Germans had deteriorated, and the Nazis started to really drain Denmark dry, taking food. The shortages became common. All of the sabotage started exploding. Trains were blown up. Rail lines were blown up. And the Danes began to hold wildcat strikes, refused to go to work. Three years into the occupation, there are growing food shortages, and you notice that more and more necessities of life are harder and harder to get. You read that the rail lines are being sabotaged all over the country. In an effort to stop all of this, the Germans institute the death penalty in Denmark for saboteurs. The death penalty never existed in Denmark, and to this day doesn't exist in Denmark. And the Danes considered it a tremendous violation of their form of freedom and democracy. The strikes continued, more and more sabotage, and finally the Germans had to declare martial law, and the government no longer functioned. It was at this point that they, to retaliate once again, wanted to deport the Jews. If you read the article, you will see how deeply ingrained this notion was that Jews were not separate people, that the Jews in Denmark were a part of a common humanity, irrespective of religion, and that it was everybody's responsibility to protect them. One of the people that I interviewed was an incredible, at the time she was an incredibly active 80-year-old woman who had had a cooking school in her home. And because people were constantly coming and going in her home to this cooking school, she had connections, and they said to her, "Do you think you could hide a couple of people for us?" And I asked her, "Well, didn't you think twice about it?" And she said, "No, I knew they were Jews." And she told me a story about that led me to understand how widespread the support was. Everybody knew what was going on. She had to go from her suburban house into the center of Copenhagen to go to the post office to pick up some money from a postal clerk so that she could give it to a person who was going to take it to a fisherman who was going to take this person to Sweden. She had a person in her house. And as she was riding on the train, she saw a young man. You know the trains in Europe, they sit across from each other. He was sitting across from her, wringing his hands. He had a really upset look on his face. And she watched him, and he had a suitcase at his feet. And she wrote out a note for him. "Do you need help?" And she handed it to him. And he opened it up, and he read it, and he looked at her, and he just went like that. And she wrote him another note. She said, "Follow me." And instead of going all the way into the main train station in Copenhagen, she got off one stop early because there were so many German guards at the main station. And she took him, and they got back on the train, and she took him home. And he stayed with her for about, she said, 3 weeks until she could arrange passage for him to Sweden. The train was packed. Everybody on that train saw what was going on. She acted as an individual, but what happened there was a social activity because no one said a word. And I heard story after story about people on the trams and the trolleys. The Germans would get on and ask to see people's papers. And the minute they knew that there were people on the trolley who, with their suitcases, no doubt, who were in imminent danger, and they would all stand up and block the Germans from getting through the car, and the people would get off at the next stop. One of the most incredible things that I heard about was there's a small town at the top of Denmark, and the name of it is Gilleleje. And there's a church in Gilleleje, and there were about 60 or 70 people who were taken to the attic of the church to await fishing boats. It's right on the tip of the top of Denmark. And someone turned them in. Someone reported to the Germans that those people were there. Every single year, they hold a play that is a reenactment of that incident and have meetings where people discuss what it means to protect each other, to be entrusted with responsibility for each other. So it wasn't just something that happened then, it's something that happens in their lives now. I found that, I thought that was pretty good. It's a translation down on the bottom, and it is a Danish cartoon. So, was the rescue of the Danish Jews that easy? Of course not. Not only can we imagine the fear and uncertainty the Jews in Denmark and their rescuers experienced, we can also think about how much courage it took to act out. I want to close with just a couple of ideas about how resistance and rescuer were related. We know that there is a positive aspect of affirming the collective identity of their society. They affirmed their collective values, what it meant to be a Dane. And one of those values meant to protect each other. I want you to consider the following. To confront the situation and stand up to the occupier, it was necessary to create new rules, to adopt new behaviors, and to work out new social practices. And also to establish new institutions that could be adapted to the situation. Nobody had done that kind of activity before, but somehow the Danes were able to do that. Resistance and rescue were new social innovations, but they had to be fashioned from strongly held beliefs and the solid collective values that are inherent in Danish society and are inherent in that society to this day, I might point out. So, I ask you to think about some things, and that is, what do we consider worth defending today? Who do we consider worth defending today? Do we have collective values? What are our values based upon? And do we get to think back and ponder once again the notion of a universe of obligation, which we talked about earlier in the semester? And a universe of obligation, to repeat, is that circle of persons toward whom obligations are owed, to whom the rules apply, and whose injuries call for compensation by the community at large. I would suggest to you that the Danish case during the World War II is an ideal case of what can happen when the principles of a universe of obligation are applied to everybody. Thank you.